encourages investment. High wages encourage consumption. If every capitalist was rational, like just think of individually rational capitalists, they would want to pay their workers as little as possible, right? And so if every capitalist pursued that rational policy of minimizing how much money their workers got, that would be individually rational for the capitalists to do that. But it would be collectively irrational, right? Because there would not be sufficient amount of money in the hands of workers to actually consume the stuff that the workers that you're hiring, paying nothing to, are producing. So one way to get around this problem, this is why I introduced this conceptual scheme, because it helps us understand globalization. Think about how globalization helps us get around this problem. Where do you pay workers nothing but still are able to sell the goods that are being produced? What is the strategy?
Developing countries.
Okay. So you go ahead.
Used to be called third world.
Third world, yeah, that's fine. Less developed, emerging markets. Depends which college you're in at the university. Underdeveloping countries. So you could think of globalization as a way to get around this contradiction. In other words, you geographically segregate the producers from the consumers. Produce abroad, pay very little, capacity to produce is good, and bring the goods back to the United States or to Western nations where people have more money to spend. Sell the goods. So that's one way to get around this situation. All right. So there's two kinds of crises in capitalism. One is a demand-side crisis, and one is a supply-side crisis. And this is based on the relationship between capital and labor. So when I talk about capital, I'm talking about the capitalist class. When I talk about labor, I'm talking about the working class, right? So the working class and the capitalist class are struggling, okay? Constantly struggling over the distribution of the surplus, over the conditions of work, etc. So when the capitalist class is very strong, the capacity to consume is weak. In other words, the capitalists are strong, they're imposing their wishes, they're keeping wages low, they're working to make the organization of workers more difficult, and so that produces, over time, what's called a demand-side crisis. Capitalist class is strong, they impose their will on workers, and over time, the problem is there's insufficient demand, and you have a demand-side crisis. That's sometimes called a wage squeeze crisis. On the other side, if labor is, and notice I never say too strong, this is where I reveal my preferences. Labor is never too strong in a capitalist society. They're always at a structural disadvantage. But when labor is relatively strong and they can organize and impose their wishes on the capitalists, what happens is that drives up costs, and it might drive up taxes, and it might drive up regulations, and there might be more worker protections. And these are things which are bad for the capacity to produce, because capitalists want good business climate conditions. So when labor is relatively strong, over time you have what's called a supply side crisis, or profit squeeze. Okay? So do you understand? These are two different kinds of crises that emerge depending on the balance of class forces. All right, so let's apply this model to the crises in the United States. So the crisis of the 1930s, the Great Depression, and there's been thousands of books written about this, and there are entire courses devoted to this. And in a minute and a half, I'm going to give you my explanation of the Great Depression. But basically, the Great Depression was, within the context of this model, is a demand-side crisis. So what happened in the 1920s was the capacity to produce was very healthy. You had large numbers of immigrant workers, you had labor surplus, you had no labor organization, significant labor organization and unions, and you also had the development of new technologies, the assembly line. Exactly.
Production
right? Production level. So, exactly. So massive amounts of investment, speculative, right? The conditions are right. We know if we invest with these conditions, we're going to see a high profit. The problem is The capacity to produce was strong. The capacity to consume was weak. The workers did not have the buying power to consume all the goods that were being produced under profitable conditions. This is sometimes called in the Marxist literature a realization crisis. What that means is that capitalists can produce goods cheaply, but they don't realize the profit because they can't sell the goods. Because the workers, in this case, in the United States, had wages that were depressed. Okay? You see how we're doing this? Well, the solution was, there's lots of theories about this. What got us out of the Great Depression, what ultimately got the economy going. Any thoughts on that? War, exactly. War is good for capitalism. There's no question about that. We know that, and that's why we have a permanent war economy. Now, other people talk to the New Deal. So the idea was, how can we stimulate the economy and put money in the hands of workers so that they have money and they will spend it and we'll get the economy going and we'll get what's called a virtuous cycle. It's called a Keynesian virtuous cycle. So the New Deal, at least the economic theory behind the New Deal, is what is called Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes. And basically, he focused on the fact that under capitalism, there tends to be periods when demand is depressed, when capitalists aren't going to invest because they can't sell the goods, because workers don't have the money, there's insufficient funds running through the system, and so the state, the government, has to step in and stimulate the economy, hire workers. Back in the 1930s, when people didn't have a job, they created jobs for people. That wasn't such a horrible concept back then, right? Like, people wanted to work, so why don't we just create jobs by the government to do things which the society needs? You suggest that today, and people, they don't take it seriously. So the whole ideology has entirely changed. But at that time, and Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin Delano, he wasn't a socialist, right? He was a capitalist. He came out of a capitalist family. How did he convince the capitalists to go along with this? Because he had to tax them at a high rate. He expanded the government. We had Social Security. We had the National Labor Relations Act. All of these things were taking place. The capitalist class didn't like this. They didn't want to be taxed. They didn't want the government involved. They didn't want unions to have power. And Roosevelt just turned to them and said, "Did you see what happened in Russia?" And said, this could happen here, right? Because in the United States at that time, you had socialists, you had communists, you had anarchists. The immigrant population was very, very radical. And there was a mass social movement taking place during the Depression, which, by the way, is absent now. So that's one of the reasons why, in some ways, we do not see the kinds of changes in policy, but we'll get to that. So we have Keynesian economic policy, expansion of the state, military spending is called military Keynesianism. Okay, it's a great term, right? Military Keynesianism. Now, most of the people who like military spending will say they're not Keynesians because they don't like Keynes. And they don't want the government intervening in the economy, except when it involves investing in military hardware. Remember, that is money spent in the defense industry. It's also money that's spent funding bases in the state of Florida, for example. So Rick Scott was very upset when, the feds stopped spending. This is a guy that doesn't want the Fed to do anything, right? And then suddenly he was complaining because they were cutting spending which would affect the bases in Florida where people were hired and worked in the military sector, right? So Rick Scott's a military Keynesian, you can call him that if it pisses him off. All right, so that's Keynesian economic policy. That's the nicest thing you can say about him. Yeah, exactly. All right, so you go through this period, the post-war, it's called the post-war boom, right? So yes, you had the war, and then basically 1945 to the mid-1970s is regarded as really like the golden age of American capitalism. That's when we had massive capitalist growth, expansion, manufacturing, upward mobility, declines in inequality. This upward mobility, right? This was the period, when most people think about American capitalism, what they think about is this period, 1945 to about 1980. As if that characterizes the nature of American capitalism. It could be an anomaly, But it's that anomalous period which tends to shape the way people think about American capitalism, despite what's happened since the late 1970s. So what happens, okay? You've got Keynesian economics, you have the expansion of the state, you have the expansion of government agencies, unions are relatively strong during this period, manufacturing is healthy, and a large segment of the manufacturing workers are union members, okay? Represented by unions. Some people call that period, the 1945 to the mid-1970s, the period of the labor capital accord, okay? The labor capital accord. And that's an interesting term because the idea was there was some kind of a social contract between workers and capitalists. Because remember, if you go back to the necessary conditions for capitalism, capitalists don't want high wages. They want low wages. So you have to convince the capitalist class that they have an interest in high wages, and Ford, the example of Ford, right, paying his workers more, he said, who else is going to buy the damn car, right? You had to convince the capitalists that paying higher wages was not a pure cost. You understand? It's not a pure cost. That is, yes, it's a cost of production, but it produces the consumers who buy the goods you're producing, and therefore you realize the profit. So we talked about a non-zero sum game, right? In a zero sum game, anything that workers get, I lose. Anything that I get, workers lose.
That's like the rising tide lifts all boats.
That's right. Okay. So this was a period, even though if you were a Marxist, you said these fucking workers are getting exploited. We need to change this. Right? Marxists now they look back and say, oh, those are the golden ages for workers, you know, right? So, you know, the retrospective is a lot different than when you're going through it. So this labor capital accord was the what people call the social structure of accumulation, right? Like what was the institutional, political, economic, cultural arrangement during that period, 1945, roughly the post-war period, to about the mid-1970s, capital labor accord. Some balance, okay? Some balance between the capacity to produce and capacity to consume. But over time, all right, and this is actually a principle of Marxist theory, and that is that the solution to one crisis plants the seeds for the next crisis. So the Keynesian model, the expansion of the state, the higher taxes, the represented, the ability of workers to represent themselves through labor unions, etc., all of that was a part of this boom, but over time, it was pissing off the capitalist class. So you go into the 1970s, and what you get is, this is the lament, taxes are too high, unions are too strong, welfare is too generous, regulations are too stringent. Think about that. Taxes, labor, welfare, regulations. Excessive. It's all too much. And the capitalist class rebels, right? Now, when I was in the 1970s, when I was, taking these courses, we're always talking about the workers are exploited, and young workers are coming in, and they're going to see that, they don't have any control over the workplace, and they're going to work. It wasn't the workers that rebelled; it was the capitalist class that rebelled against the system. Yeah, effectively, right? So what did they do? Basically, they stopped investing. It's called a capital strike, disinvestment. In other words, the capacity to produce was very unhealthy from the perspective of the capitalists. You understand? They did not believe that under these conditions, high taxes, welfare too generous, unions too strong, too many regulations, I'm going to stop investing my money because I don't believe that I can get a good return on my investment because this has raised costs too high. And you have a massive organization of the right to institute a new model, a new system. You have the emergence of all these think tanks, Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation. They go on the warpath. There's something that was written by the former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell. Check out the Powell Memo. This was something he wrote before he became a member of the Supreme Court, where he came before the Chamber of Commerce and he basically said, we are under attack from democracy, okay? from democracy, from the left. And we need a counteroffensive. And the counteroffensive was put into place. So, in this model, you call it a profit squeeze, right? The capitalists said, profits are being squeezed. We're not going to invest. If they don't invest, we're all fucked. Remember that, okay? That's the problem with capitalism. If they decide they're not happy with conditions and invest their money, the whole economy slows down. It goes into recession. And we have this thing called stagflation, which never existed. You couldn't even find it in an economics textbook. It was like dry water, Like the economy is slowed, and there's, unemployment is rising, but you still have inflation, stagnation and inflation. These things aren't supposed to go together. Okay? When the economy goes into recession, usually you don't have inflation. We want inflation now, actually, today.
I'm sorry, I missed
Yeah,
the
go
last
ahead.
30 seconds over there.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Anyone ask any question, then
you were saying there was an investment